Hello and welcome. My name is Ovi Pearson, and in this video, I'll be analyzing and categorizing the different types of vampires from different culture, age groups, and genres. To different historical folklore, mythological history, and first-person account, I'll be comparing and contrasting what they represented to the particular culture and how they have evolved throughout the years. The goal is to understand how vampire lore affected the community in which it was believed to exist, and how the citizens of those communities perceived the vampires. Enjoy. It was just before midnight as Gheorghe Marinescu and 5 of his relatives crept into the graveyard in the small Romanian village of Marotinu de Sus. They knew which plot they were looking for: a simple earth grave with a wooden cross bearing the name Petre Toma, a 76-year-old grandfather who passed away 5 weeks ago. They quickly and quietly set about digging. When they had dragged the body out, they waited. Then, at the stroke of midnight, Marinescu began the ritual that he had been planning for weeks, one that had been passed from generation to generation to his family. They drove a pitchfork through Petre Toma's chest, opened it, drew out his heart, and then put stakes through the rest of his body. They sprinkled garlic over the mutilated corpse and then carefully laid it back in its grave. They left the cemetery with the heart impaled on the end of the pitchfork and went to the crossroads where Marinescu's wife, son, and daughter-in-law were waiting. There, the group burnt the heart of Toma, dissolved the ashes, and then drank the solution. An autopsy carried out by the authorities in Craiova confirmed that the heart was indeed taken. The 6 people explained that after the death of Toma, they had felt weakened, as if they did not have any more blood. One night, I saw it in my room. In the morning, I could not arise. So much I was weakened, said the granddaughter of Toma, Mirela Marinescu. According to her, as soon as the exorcism ritual was performed, the dead body did not come anymore to haunt its family. When we lifted the coffin lid, his arms were not on his chest as we left them, but on his sides, said Marinescu. His head was turned to the side, and his lips were stained with dried blood. After the corpse's chest had been opened with a wooden stake and heart was removed, it was full of fresh blood, said Marinescu. His body relaxed and we heard him sigh. The heart was burnt over the embers of a fire, and the ashes was stirred into a bottle of water from the village well to make a potion. The vampire's victims recovered after drinking its blood, but Toma's daughter called the police. Investigators soon discovered evidence of up to 20 vampire slayings in the past few years. At the regional police station, the commissioner, Gheorghe Sandu, said, "I would like to be able to say that the village is unique, but unfortunately I can't, because I know just how strong belief in vampires is here." This scene fits into any number of films about vampires and the Dracula legend, but Gheorghe Marinescu is real. The entire story is real. This happened on April 11th, 2004 in the village of Marotinu de Sus, Craiova, Romania. Him and his 5 relatives were sentenced to 6 months in jail for the unlawful exhumation of the body of Toma, a former teacher and a man they believed had risen from the dead to drink their blood while they slept. This particular ritual is quite unique, but there have been many cases of people claiming that they are being haunted by the undead and vampires. There are a number of other rituals that exist for this type of situations where people believe they need to kill vampire or kill the supernatural being. Romania has been associated with vampires in the minds of Westerners ever since Bram Stoker's horror story Dracula back in 1897. But in Romania, the belief of vampires and the threat of the undead stretches as far back as the 15th century with the leader of Wallachia, modern-day Transylvania, also known as the Vlad Tepes or Vlad the Impaler Dracula. However, the myth and legend existed in Romania way before it and under a different name known as Strigoi. The basic definition of a strigoi, it originates in the medieval Romanian folklore. It is basically the standard form of an evil spirit or demonic spirit. According to the stories, a vampire is a strigoi possessing a bat, just like a werewolf is a strigoi possessing a wolf. There are different ways to become a strigoi. One, be the seventh child of the same sex in a family. If a family has 6 children and they're all boys, if the 7th child is also a boy, that 7th child has higher chance to become a strigoi after his death. Another way to become a strigoi is to live a life of sin. Another way would be to die without being married. Interesting. You can also become a strigoi by dying of being executed for perjury. After someone commits suicide, that's another way. Or, of course, being cursed by a witch, that will be another way to become a strigoi. To get rid of strigoi or kill a strigoi would be to first, there's 6 steps. Step 1, exhume the strigoi. Step 2, remove its heart and cut it in 2. You have that option. Third step, drive a nail in its forehead. Fourth step, place a clove of garlic under its tongue or around the body, like we saw earlier in the Marinescu story. Smear its body with pig fat killed on a certain gypsy holiday or Romani holiday. Turn its body face down so that if the strigoi were ever to wake up, it would be headed towards the afterlife. But while Dracula and vampires is just a fascinating legend to most people outside the country, to many Romanians, mostly in rural areas, they are terrifying reality. After his arrest, Marinescu said if he hadn't done anything, his wife, his son, and his daughter-in-law would have died. That is when he decided to unbury Toma. He said, "I've seen this kind of things." The entire family really believed in the existence of a strigoi. He even explained to the police that Toma, who he said had been a respected and well-liked teacher in the village for years, had been buried on Christmas Day in 2003. But soon afterward, he had begun to appear to members of Marinescu's family in dreams as a vampire. Although he did not see the man himself, he saw his family become sick, and they told him that Toma was not just a dream but a vampire whose spirit had come back from the dead. He, like the rest of his family, had been told how to recognize vampires and how to deal with them by his parents, whom had been taught that knowledge from their own parents and them from theirs. He said he had to act quickly to save his family. Marotino de Sus is in the southwest of Romania and is far from the only village in Romania to take the threat of vampires seriously. In many rural communities like this one across the country, belief in vampires is pervasive and superstition governs people's life. Fear and great challenges in life are sometimes met by people with rituals and superstitions, a set of rules built over generation which has been verified over time. As a native Romanian myself, I can say that rural Romania has conserved excellently this system of rituals and beliefs. When something had happened, something negative had happened, the logical reasoning behind its explanation must be supernatural, must be a strigoi. Therefore, rituals, traditions, and supernatural solutions need to be used to solve them. Around 20 years ago, before I joined the military, I was living in my dad's hometown in the Philippines after he had retired from service. They have a lot of their own ghost stories there, some downright myths and folklore, others being unexplained and not quite unprovable. Some people say that at a young age we can see ghosts and spirits, and as you get older you lose this ability, but some people retain this ability. I don't know what it is about Filipinos, but a lot of them that I know apparently retain that ability. Some of the weirdest stories in the Philippines are things like Aswang, a shape-shifting monster, and the Manananggal. which are roughly the equivalent of vampires. These are strange beings that have the ability to detach the upper body from the lower body at night and fly around, they supposedly have wings, to feed on young children. I personally didn't believe in these stories until my parents told me of a time when my mother was 3 months pregnant with me. They would wake up in wee hours of the morning to the neighbor's dog howling, despite there not being anything outside when my dad checked. They wouldn't stop howling until morning came, and you can hear the dogs closest to us growl quietly, while the dogs further away would start to pick up and start barking. The housemaid also mentioned that they could hear the flapping of wings from where they slept. In their suspicious and confused state, they accepted the fact that a manananggal had sensed that there was a fetus nearby, but my mom said that the roof was well made, so it had trouble trying to get through cracks that weren't even there. They hung garlic and sprinkled salt whenever they can and wherever they can. Most of the time stayed close to the windows. A lot of the time, the baby was offered a cross or the Virgin Mary icon to carry around and protect the baby throughout their vulnerable early years. I heard stories of classmates and friends of friends who had similar stories about this child being hunted by a vampire right before delivery and even after, when the baby was born, up to around 2 years old. The previous story is being narrated by Danilo de la Cruz, a Filipino man who describes the story of his mother's early pregnant months with him and her encounter with the famous mythological Filipino vampire, the Manananggal. This supernatural folklore were stories to believe in that were passed down from generation to generation. The story took place around 1997, which goes to show how prevalent this belief is still today in the Philippines. Manananggals are creatures from Philippines mythology. The word manananggal means to separate or to remove itself. It is an evil blood-sucking vampire, witch, or female-eating monster. It is half human and half bat and can separate its torso and spread huge bat-like wings. Their presence is signaled by crows or black cats. They're also called tick-tick, representing the sound the wings make while flying. It is meant to confuse their victims. They are portrayed as beautiful young women when they try to prey on men, but during the night they transform into monsters. They attack people in their sleep and sucks their blood. Legend said that manananggals prey on pregnant women and sucks the heart of the fetus with their long tongue. The manananggal have wide eyes and wild hair. Its teeth have the ability to sprout into fangs, and its fingers can change into long, sharp claws. There are 2 different ways to become a manananggal. You can turn yourself into a manananggal by chanting a special incantation, anointing yourself with oil, and procuring an egg that contains a black chick. A second option, a woman can be infected by and transformed into a manananggal by eating a black baby chicken that was raised inside the throat of another manananggal. No worries, you can be cured by tying herself upside down to a tree and spinning around until she vomits the infection up. A very common method also used to cure from hangovers. This black chick is passed from one manananggal to another manananggal, a relative like a family heirloom. To destroy one, the lower part stays standing and it is very vulnerable. If the bottom is destroyed, the upper part cannot rejoin and would die at sunrise. They hit garlic and salt, so if you put that at the top of their bottom side, it will destroy the bottom side and they will eventually die at sunrise. They can also be killed with a whip from the tail of a stingray. They are afraid of bright lights, as mentioned, garlic and salt, vinegar, spices, and daggers. To keep one away from your home, you can leave pots of uncooked rice, ash, or salt around the vicinity of the house. If they spot any of those items from the roof of the house, they may decide not to enter. This type of vampire is definitely more terrifying and less romantic in comparison to the Slavic or Balkan vampire. These mythical creatures appeared in literature as early as 1582 in Spanish missionary texts. They can signify the horror and emotional distress that come with miscarriage. In ancient Philippines, females held important roles as shaman priestesses, mediums, healers, and midwives. It's also been documented that women in pre-colonized Philippines exhibited some level of sexual freedom. When the Europeans came to the Philippines, the real concern may be based on the fear of uncontrolled women. In contrast, the fear in the regional Southeast Asia may be of something or someone who may represent a danger to their children, combining them both, forming the Manananggal. There are examples of pre-colonial women who enjoyed a political and economically more balanced relationship with men than did their European counterparts. The Spanish Catholics, Menes, explains with their dark and repressed attitudes towards sexuality, were shocked by the natives' easygoing manners when it came to sexual behavior. Colonizers slandered Filipino priestesses to try and take away their power and enforce Christianity on their islands. Spaniards instilled fear in the people by calling shaman witches or ashwa to associate them with the devil. We can see that manipulation of the story has been made by different cultural views and religious views in order to suit one's needs and attitudes. The colonizers could have been the ones starting the vampiric story that one day would have become a mythical legend. The story begins with the unsolved murder of a local ill-natured and quarrelsome peasant. 2 days after burial, the man's apparition was seen walking around the town at night. He rumbled about people's goods, put out their lamps, gripped them from behind, and 1,000 other muddy tricks. A source of amusement until the better sort of people began to complain. Important town folks, monks, and priests soon concluded. They would say a mass and pull out the corpse's heart to drive out the demon. The town butcher, an old clumsy fellow, was the one in charge of removing the heart. Piton noted that the butcher initially opened the corpse at the belly, then groped around the entrails in search of it until someone suggested he instead try the chest cavity. It was a smelly process, and the observers burned frankincense to cover it. This was an error, according to Piton, describing that the smoke mixed with the exhalation from the carcasses increased the stink and began to muddle the poor people. The result? Their imagination, struck with a spectacle before them, grew full of visions. Suddenly, they were all increasingly bawling out, "Vrikolakas!" a cry of horror that spread rapidly throughout the town. The butcher reported that the body was still warm, and instead, that the blood smeared on his hands were bright red. Those who had carried the corpse recounted that the body was not stiff. Piton skeptically added that, "I don't doubt they would have sworn it did not stink, had not we been there." Piton and his companions tried to explain why the decomposing entrails might have felt warm, commenting that the blood on the butcher's hands didn't seem especially red, but unfortunately nobody listened. The town authorities decided to burn the heart on the seashores, but the haunting continued until everyone was frightened out of their senses. The Vrikolakas took the beating people, breaking doors, windows, and roofs, tearing clothes, and worst of all, emptying all the bottles and vessels around. "He was the most thirsty devil," commented Piton. Confronted with this epidemical disease of the brain, the botanist and his friends held their tongue, knowing that they would likely be accused of being atheists or infidels. Although they recommended that the local authorities keep watch for the vagabonds behind the troubles, the solution was increasingly clear to the townspeople. They had not previously disposed of the body. On January 1st, 1701, the devil finally met his match in the townspeoples who lit a bonfire of joy to burn the corpse. Peace was finally restored to Mykonos. The account tells us much about the folklore belief in the region. The Vrikolakas has much in common with both the vampires of Eastern Europe and the ghosts of Western Europe. The Greeks traditionally believed that a person could become a Vrikolakas after death due to a sacrilegious way of life, an excommunication, a burial in unconsecrated ground, or eating the meat of a sheep that had been wounded by a wolf or a werewolf. People with red hair and gray eyes at the time in history were thought to be vampires according to the accounts near the region of modern Serbia. Some believed that a werewolf itself could become a powerful vampire after being killed and would retain the wolf-like fangs, hairy palms, and glowing eyes it formerly possessed. To destroy or avoid a vrikolakas, the most common would be exorcism, impaling, beheading, cutting into pieces, and especially cremating the suspected corpse that it had been freed from living death and its victims may be safe. They are harmful undead creatures in Greek folklore. Like vampires, the Revenant had been a difficult person in life. The only way to be rid of the problem was through correctly disposing the body. The Vrikolakas was also typical of many early modern vampires, that blood drinking was not part of the story, but rather the monster eats flesh, particularly liver. Like ghosts, the Revenant potentially had some form of unfinished business, although nobody seemed bothered about finding the murderer. Joseph Piton also reveals much about the growing division between popular belief and scientific knowledge, particularly in terms of evidence. The botanist and butcher both looked at the body but had very different explanations. The botanist identified problems in the butcher's examination and conclusions and could provide an obvious, rational explanation, vagabonds, for most of the problem. The butcher, in contrast, interpreted the case within an entirely different worldview, entirely supported by the lay and religious authorities, in which the troublesome living inevitably made for troublesome dead. Joseph Piton, of course, appears as a logical and rational person to our modern eyes, but for the people of Mykonos, his explanation made no sense. It was Piton who would have seemed full of visions. Throughout this video, I reviewed types of vampiric characters that have been identified within different cultures, with the Romanian version of the vampire, also known as the Strigoi, the frightening Filipino half-bodied vampire, the Manananggal, and the wolf-like vampire from the Greek mythology, the Vrikolakas. Different cultures that saw these creatures to be rational justification of certain death, destruction, plague, or natural disasters. These characters were created by naive, uneducated local peasants, but also educated and maleficent higher-class citizens to be used as propaganda in socially controlling a population. We have evolved from these mythological ways of belief. We have created tools, we wrote literature, and found ways to analyze these myths and explain the unexplainable. Together, we created these monsters back in the days, and together, we can slowly unveil their masks. It is only then that we can identify and realize that underneath these masks is me and you.